So you will be able to share this with anyone who wasn't able to make it and would have been interested. Okay, awesome. So we're joined this morning by Dr. Mara Nogueira and Persis Taraporevala to discuss the topic of urban sustainability and building equitable, inclusive resilience to climate change. But really, climate change is kind of a springboard for discussion here because it connects to so many other things like water security, food availability, debates around technology and governance, but all of that wouldn't really fit in a session title. So expect a wide-ranging discussion this morning, and I'm really excited to learn from Persis and Mara. So Mara is the Programme Director for the Birkbeck MSc in Sustainable Cities. Mara, do you want to start by telling us a little bit about your research and what you teach about?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for inviting us, Aideen. I think that's a great idea, great way to get to know the students, but also each other, right? Because sometimes we teach alongside each other and we don't really know much about each other's research. So as Aideen said, I'm the program director for the MSc Sustainable Cities and the MSc Geography, but at the moment I'm on research leave. Doing research in Brazil. That's the early time for me here. I teach on several modules. I also teach in the International Development and Social Justice, MSc. I teach on urban sustainability, critical infrastructures for sustainability with Alana, who's here with us as well. International Development and Social Justice, and cities in the Global South. You asked us to talk a bit about why we were interested in urban research. Maybe I can say a little bit about that, if that's okay. I think I was thinking about that question, and I think I was always interested in cities as since I can remember. But my initial studies were actually in economics, so a bit far from the topic. And then I did both my undergraduate and my MSc in economics. And then I was, for my dissertation in for the MSc, I wanted to research at the time Brazil's housing policy. And then I started reading about cities, and I found out that economics had very little to say about them. And saw myself reading more and more geography and urban research more generally. So then I decided to do the PhD in urban studies. So I did the PhD in human geography and urban studies. And I've been doing research on cities ever since, with a focus on urbanization in the Global South, with lots of interest in urban inequality, as I'm going to be talking a bit more throughout this morning.
Amazing, thank you. And Persis, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you teach and the programs that you're involved in and your research?
Yeah, hi. And again, repeating what Mara said, thank you for organizing this. It's really exciting to be able to speak to each other. I'm Persis. I'm a lecturer with the School of Social Sciences. I'm also the program director for the MSc in Global Environment and Sustainability, which is a University of London MSc program that runs through Birkbeck. And I will be teaching on the food systems module that runs in the next term. And I do, do some lectures on other modules. I mean, Mara's module program as well. Then there's human environment, contemporary world and globalization. So different components, mostly on urban studies, lectures. So I am here in the capacity of an environmental geographer. But my research more recently has been on urban geography. And I say but because I know those are not actually not there is an overlap, but in terms of environmental geography, it's food systems. And I have a practitioner background where I have worked on issues, and my focus has been on India, and worked on issues of like sort of forest rights, biodiversity, indigenous people's rights in India, within which food does play an important role. And I think it's with that background and sort of my understanding as a geographer that I am in the capacity of this sort of lectureship for a fixed term contract. But my research is predominantly focused on governance and urban governance, and the scalar politics of democratic institutions in India. And I think this is, I'll explain that like a little bit, but I think when we're talking about climate change and sustainability, I will be bringing it back to ideas of what it means to have local democracy within the context of India. And my research has come out of, being a citizen in a large city in India where, services and local democracy don't always sort of have equitable outcomes, and an interest that grew out of that. I have a development studies background, and then moved to human geography because there was space to study sort of the impacts of smart cities and privatization in local government in India. That's sort of been my journey.
Amazing, thank you. So Mara, could you maybe start us off with thinking about some of the cities that you've studied, maybe tell us a little bit more about them and what the climate or environmental challenges that those cities are facing is, in your view?
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I don't know if it was on purpose, but you ended up with two urban geographers focusing on the global south, right? And I think that, I mean, my understanding is that Brazil and India, although they're quite different, they have similar challenges, and I might say some stuff here that might resonate with Persis. So my main focus has been on Brazil. I study mostly the city where I am right now, which is called Belo Horizonte, which is, I would say, the fifth biggest city in Brazil, but nobody has ever heard about it. And that's one of the reasons I like studying it, because when people think Brazil, they think São Paulo, Rio, and I think urban dynamics elsewhere are also relevant. So as I said before, my main focus on research has been on urban inequalities. And I focus on a process that the literature calls peripheral urbanization, which is the way through which cities in the global south, we can think elsewhere as well, tend to be built, which is by the people themselves, particularly the urban poor who don't have access to housing markets. They build their own houses from the bottom up, sometimes without support from the government, many times without support from the government, a lot of times against the state and its kind of security forces. And the reason why I say that is because these areas which are occupied by the urban poor, they tend to be located near areas of environmental risk or near areas of industrial waste, for instance, and the fact that they also are poorly served by infrastructure creates a number of compounded risks that I think exacerbate environmental hazards as well as the impacts of climate change. So we can think about many ways through which this process of urbanization mediates how environmental risk and climate change are sort of perceived or felt by these urban populations. And I can give one example, which is not necessarily something that I study, but that shows up in my research, which is access to water. So you can think about how many times these neighborhoods that are built from the bottom up are not connected to the main grid of water access. So people will have an unreliable access to water on an everyday basis. And you can think of how that becomes even worse when you have droughts, for instance. And thirdly, these areas tend to be affected by flooding much more prominently than other areas in the city because of their characteristics, right? Being near hillsides and the constructions and the houses being precarious and so on and so forth. So these are topics that I explore both in my Cities in the Global South module, which is focused particularly on this process of urbanization, and then we reflect on several of the kinds of challenges that are created by these kinds of cities. But also the urban sustainability module covers the, I don't know what Anna's doing, who's covering me to be honest, but the lecture that I give on that module talks about this kind of intersection between environmental risk and processes of peripheral urbanization. So you asked us to think about a more obvious aspect, and I think that's a kind of very obvious one, that environmental risk is not evenly kind of impacting people in areas of the world. And one of that aspect that I think less obvious that I study, and I think Persis mentioned as well, is food access in urban areas. So for the last couple of years, I've been doing research on food access in urban peripheries in Brazil. And the research was carried during COVID, which was not our choice, but obviously happened while we were doing the project. And we could see how COVID itself, but also the kind of food insecurity that was being generated by the impacts of the pandemic were impacting low-income people much more harshly. And this kinds of patchy access to infrastructure that I'm talking about impacts people everyday food practices as well. And we've been mapping those. So for instance, water access, but also electricity access to public transportation, retail environments in these areas, all of that is mediating people's everyday food practices. And the same day that, flooding and drought will impact low-income people more prominently, you have those periods of crisis, such as a pandemic, also having similar effects. But one thing that we also documented is how these kinds of neighborhoods fight back, right? So on the topic of adaptation and resilience, they showed a lot of resilience during the pandemic. Everywhere we did research in 5 neighborhoods in Belo Horizonte, but also in São Paulo. All the neighborhoods had some kind of bottom-up initiative to fight the effects of the pandemic, particularly around food security. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Persis, does anything resonate with you? Any similarities or differences?
Yeah, I mean, like Mara said, like there is so much that resonates, and I don't want to kind of repeat it, but my primary, the city that I study is also a large but understudied city in India. I think someone's mic is on.
That doesn't have to do with operations. When you finish your shift and you're back in the office,
Understudied large city, which is the city of Pune in Western India, and it's the city closest to the city of Mumbai. And it has a very particular kind of geography. So it's surrounded by hills. It's sort of effectively in a valley. It was historically known as a sort of very cool, and it was a colonial outpost which was sort of a soft colonial outpost, because temperature wise it was cool, you wouldn't kind of fall ill as much, and it was seen as a space which was a residential space and an educational hub. So you either studied there, you retired there, and it was kind of like this kind of component. Over the last 40 years especially, it's kind of, obviously urban expansion has taken place. The IT sector has grown in vastly over there, and also the automotive sector exists there. And so this has completely changed the ecology of the area. The primary kind of components that come to mind now are extreme heat that the city faces. And we have what are known as islands of heat because of the urban expansion. And the second one, much like Mara was saying, is so Pune is also low-lying and next to a river. And so there's flooding, there's unseasonal rain, and therefore flooding and flash flooding. And within these contexts as well, more vulnerable communities tend to live in these low-lying areas in auto-constructed housing, and are vulnerable to sort of the flooding impacts, either complete loss of housing or, sort of damage to housing. And perennial kind of sort of diseases which happen, so sort of chikungunya, dengue, all of these kind of components which have increased over the last 40 years. So these are sort of the climate impacts. And I was thinking of the ways in which these things play out. And in terms of, so my work was on smart cities, and one of the projects I tried to undertake was to, so India had a federally mandated smart cities program. So 100 cities were selected, and you were supposed to have these smart projects kind of put in. Predominantly, they were just urban development programs with some sort of a tech component. It wasn't as tech heavy as in sort of global north countries, but there were some things like sort of flooding sensors and things like that. So I had asked if I could kind of map where these different projects are. And there are two predominant bodies that are governing. So there's the Pune Municipal Corporation, which is the historical sort of city government. And there was a sort of privatized entity called the Smart City Special Purpose Vehicle, which was created. And so the special purpose vehicle was supposed to enact all the smart city projects. And the special purpose vehicle said that, due to sort of issues with because of the issue that it could be a risk to these projects, I could not map them. And then through my conversations with the municipality, when the floodings were taking place, I asked them, oh, have these, sensors which have been put in the last 2 years, were they not useful when all the flooding took place? And they were like, what sensors? And this sort of lack of communication between these two city level governance institutions meant that even though apparently there had been all these sensors put in on the riverbeds, which were these high-tech sensors, really expensive, ultimately the city had to go back to use its old school sensors which already exist, and also mostly manpower. It's very manual, like kind of going and checking, levels of water and things like that. And this isn't a climate change issue, but like if we're sort of going forward into when we're thinking about climate change solutions, you can put in kind of as much as sort of techno-bureaucratic impacts, and they might even actually work. But unless you have these kind of very human level interactions sorted out, these were sort of the kind of inadvertent, strange sort of components of climate change, which kind of came out through my research, if that's of use.
That's really interesting. It's like so complex when you start to layer all of these human and ecological systems. So thinking then about like where we want to go, Mara, I'm going to ask you this because you're the program lead for sustainable cities. What defines a sustainable city for you?
Well, I was thinking when you asked that question that we spent about 4 weeks of the module sort of like trying to talk about that question, and it's actually the first not the first assignment per se, but I asked students to reflect on a sustainable city, right? Like and they answered this question, what's a sustainable city, giving an example, and critically engaging with the notion, right? But the first few weeks we talk about how this notion of sustainability, where it comes from, that it comes from the notion of sustainable development, so it connects as well the two areas that I'm interested in. But it's quite a fuzzy notion, as you will know, 18. I think it's probably the same with like resilience and all these kinds of concepts that are very fashionable in policy making. And when you try to actually kind of look at it, what do people really mean when they say sustainable or resilient and so on and so forth? It tends to mean quite different things, right? But so it's a fuzzy concept, and it usually gets broken down into 3 kind of pillars, right? So environment, economy, and society, right? So you have these 3 kinds of sustainability, and because I think of my background and of my interest in inequalities, I tend to focus on the last one, which is the one that I try to convince students that it's the one that's mostly overlooked, right? And I think that links with what Persis was talking about, because you have all this kind of fancy techno-managerial kind of solutions to climate change, and the social impact or the social interactions with those systems tend to be overlooked, right? So my answer to that is a little bit kind of like, I think a sustainable city has to be a just city, right? It has to cater for the needs of all its people, and that means being attuned to inequalities, right? And the ways for which sometimes sustainable solutions might have unwanted consequences for some groups of people, right? So that means, I think, people having access to opportunities and services equally, right? Bear in mind the differences as well that different groups might have, as well as people's kind of access to governance, right? To get into, I think, Persis' area of knowledge here, she can talk more about that. But I think the sort of city making and the imagination of the future has to be a collective kind of endeavor, right? So not only people want to experience the city equally, but also they want to be involved in the processes of city making that will generate a just city, right? So I also think that sustainability is not about, because I think the way it's talked about sometimes, it's about reproducing the present, right? So it's elongating the kinds of systems that we have in place nowadays, and it's quite controversial because, you know, those are the systems that are generating the impacts that are kind of like making our world unsustainable. So I think sustainability is also about deeper change than just, you know, making a green wall here and there, if that makes sense. So it's really has to be about rethinking how we distribute resources in order for them to be accessed by all for the longer time. I think that would be it. It's quite like a general idea, but we can get into the nitty-gritty of it in a bit.
Amazing. Persis, would you add anything to that? Is sustainability a helpful term for where cities need to get to, or do we add other layers to it?
I mean, I think, you know, it's a scaffolding. It's something you can kind of start with, and it's not the end result. So, I mean, I don't think I have much more to add to Mara's thing. I think my perception of sustainability does fall more within the sort of governance component. And within that, I agree that if we were to foreground structural inequality and how climate change impacts vulnerable communities, I think it would be a useful way of looking at sustainability, because so Indian cities are currently small and large Indian cities are now creating their individual climate action plans. And these are sort of state supported with sort of, you know, Bloomberg and McKinsey, and sort of it's the state and private and sort of fintech kind of component and engagement process. But if you look at it, it's fairly positivist, and it's important information you should have. Sort of what has been the degradation in terms of, you know, tree cover or environmental damage, or what is air quality in a city. And it's these, you know, very multi-layered studies, without which does not take into consideration very core issues such as vulnerability, and especially the idea of caste. Most people who will be impacted by climate change in urban areas will be those without access to resources. And within India, that has a very strong caste component. The second thing for me is again, these are very sort of nuanced, and I'm sure in every geography there will be some sort of similar kind of though I hope not to the extent that it is in India, but in India, like sanitation workers are very much a caste-based process, with oppressed communities having to take on the majority of cleaning Indian cities' sewages physically without, gear. And there are so many deaths in relation to this. And so as you have sort of flooding and flash flooding, and all of that has to be taken care of by these sort of caste communities of sanitation workers, how are they impacted by climate change? So when we're talking about just cities and sort of, I think, foregrounding the structural inequality can help us sort of count, because the techno part is important and it will be there, but to counter it by sort of saying, yes, and this is equally important. I think, and this is exactly what Mara said. So I'm just kind of giving it a more sort of India focus, but yeah, this is kind of when I'm thinking of sustainability.
Yeah, it's a lot of kind of themes that seem to resonate across the different contexts. Mara, Persis gave us some examples where sustainability initiatives didn't seem to quite work out as planned. Have you encountered similar in Brazilian cities where initiatives that were supposed to deliver on sustainability maybe didn't quite go to plan or had unintended consequences?
I think that's the case quite often, right? Like that unintended consequences. I think any initiative always has, right? Like sometimes, and one thing is what you plan to do, one thing is what's delivered, and so on and so forth. I was thinking more broadly about examples that people in this call might know about that there are not necessarily in Brazil, but there are some terms that we talk about in class that I think might be interesting for people to kind of get to know. One of them is the notion of green gentrification. That has, for instance, the High Line Park in New York as an example, right? So sort of an urban infrastructure, right? And a park that is sort of then creates a lot of effects in the housing markets. It ends up then affecting low-income people by making them move out from the area. There's the notion of bourgeois environmentalism as well, when you have solutions to environmental problems that are catering particularly to middle class. And India actually has a good example of that. Sorry, Persis, stealing your example here, but the classic case in India is middle class neighborhood associations using environmental arguments to displace slums because they are seen as polluting the environment, polluting cities, and so on and so forth. And I've encountered that kind of bourgeois environmentalism in Brazil as well. When I was doing my PhD research, there was this particular area, very middle class area, that didn't want a particular kind of urban infrastructure to be placed in their neighborhood, and they fought against it. And one of the main arguments was the impact on the environment, and not to say that the impact was not there, but my conclusion at the time was that the environment became just an argument, and what they were really interested in was to keeping their ways of life, keeping the property values, and so on and so forth intact. And you see that a lot in Brazilian cases where middle class groups use we use the environment and environmental kind of discourse to try and keep that privilege, essentially, and keeping away and then you can think about how that will impact other people, right? If you, let's say, if there is an industrial kind of site that would be located near to your middle class neighborhood, and they say we don't want it, and they have more power to say that, this industrial site will end up near a low income neighborhood, because those people won't have the same power to say no, right? So that's again how this kind of different power dynamics that cities are made of impact how environmental risk is distributed, right? More recently, I came across a case study. One of my case studies for the food project that I was mentioning was in an urban occupation, which is essentially like a newly formed settlement that since 2013 that people occupied on empty land, right, that belonged to somebody and built their houses, and they went through a long process of dispute with the state to stay in this area. And more recently, then the state started to pay attention to this area and to propose projects for urbanizing, provide infrastructure and so on and so forth to this area. And this is positive, and I think has to do with creating a more sustainable, more just city. However, the residents were happy about this project because they saw it as kind of reproducing old solutions and replacing all the work that they have done in creating that neighborhood by themselves. And this neighborhood, for instance, people tend to live in houses, and they tend to have urban gardens, which are important for them in terms of their access to food, but also their ways of life, right? And this urbanization project would displace people from their houses and relocate them to apartment blocks. And they were happy about that because in apartments, they wouldn't be able to have urban gardens, for instance. And also they are unsuitable most of the times to the sort of household structures of these kinds of places, right, where people tend to build extra space for relatives, for children, and so on and so forth. So I think that's the more recent case that I can mention, where a project that I think had good intentions was not well received for some of the impacts that it would have. They're very contextual in this case.
Thanks, Mara. And I've dropped a link to the short film that came out of that food project that you did for anyone who wants to learn more about it as well. So thinking about a more positive note, back to Persis for this one, have you come across any initiatives or things that went well, success stories where the project went well and the entire community benefited, and these negative side effects that we've been talking about were mitigated somehow? How do we mitigate it?
I haven't actually come across like a sort of very positive story, because also the scale of these cities, that even a well-intentioned project like a small city in India is a city with a population of under 500,000 people. So the cities that we're looking at are closer to within the millions. And so there's always exclusion, and the exclusion often impacts the most vulnerable. I do think with the smart cities mission, so they tried to get kind of feedback from citizens on what do you think is a smart city? So the idea was not to say, okay, this kind of a technology coming in makes it smart, but what do you think is smart? And then can we use this towards creating a city that is smart, that reflects its citizens' ideas? To a certain degree, they did try to make it accessible. So a majority of it was online, and that effectively, either due to language, because it would be in English, or due to access to the internet and digital divides, would have been problematic. But the Pune Municipal Corporation did try to reach out to schools, to different kinds of residential areas, and put out notifications in newspapers, multilingual notifications, and radio engagement and things like that. So there was an attempt. And I think that would be, those kind of, it was still quite problematic in what came out, but there was an attempt to kind of broaden that process. But I think kind of going forward, what certain questions are like, who does the state see? So if you're taking in resident feedback, and as Mara says, like, so resident welfare associations are these sort of middle class neighborhoods which sort of exclude even like who who does the state see? So if the state doesn't see renters because your domicile is not from that city, but you're perhaps from Delhi and living there, do you get to give an impact and feedback into the city? And what if you have auto-constructed housing? The city can only talk to people that it recognizes within residential areas. If you have auto-constructed housing on encroached land, the city's master plan does not view you as a resident. So I think those kind of processes, how do we ensure and integrate marginalized communities within these discussions? And I think Mara has spoken at length about the just city, and someone in the comments has also pointed out the right to the city. The Indian state refuses to use the word the right to the city. There's a lot of things that, so economic opportunity and the city is very much always associated, or access to good services and sort of this kind of consumer / worker engagement and with the city. But I think if we're talking about sustainable cities, you have to have a right to the city, and also who does it. And I maybe do this more in the question and answers, but a lot of Indian cities are administratively run, which means the local democratic municipality is not run by an elected body, but by bureaucrats who will be out of there in 3 years. So there is a democratic and an ethical quandary in that, but there's also a long-term issue. If you're going to move out in 3 to 5 years, as well-intentioned as you are, how much of continuity do you have in this space, and how do people hold you accountable? So I think kind of going forward in positive sort of or better practices, especially within like India, which is increasingly urbanizing, there needs to be a stronger focus on sort of democratic institutions at the local level. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A.
Thanks, Persis. And Mara, we'll leave the last question to you. Again, what do you think can be done better? And there's a question in the chat panel about how this thinking applies to new towns and cities, so the planning of new cities. Is there anything we can do to avoid some of the problems that we've been discussing going forward with designing and building a new city, for example?
Yeah, I saw that. It's from Phil, who's one of our Sustainable Cities students. I think that's a question for you, Phil. Maybe you can do your dissertation on it. But I think that in terms of what can be done better, perhaps I think, just following up a little bit the question that we're discussing with Persis, this idea of having more democratic kind of forum for participation. For instance, like Brazil has actually a good track record on that in terms of unlike India, kind of the right to the city is in Brazil's constitution, and we have a whole kind of the city statute, which is the federal law from 2001 that recognizes the right to the city and has kind of created several types of instruments to implement practices and initiatives which would deliver on the right to the city. But then you have the other issue, which is what happens when you get an idea such as the right to the city, and we could say the same thing about sustainability and so on and so forth, and you take it from the realm of ideas and you implement it in the realm of law and policy, right? Some things tend to get lost. But for instance, like the case study that I was talking about, this community that essentially of underprivileged, marginalized populations that occupy unwanted empty land to build their own houses, to escape rent in expensive cities where, of course, their income doesn't allow them to participate in the housing market. That, they remain there, right? So it's a very disputed space. It was a huge piece of land, lots of economic interests, and they were able to remain there, and that they are up until now, because of the kinds of laws that Brazil has, right? Because of those kinds of spaces for citizens to participate, and these arenas for democratic participation, right? So I think we have advanced a bit, but of course, we can talk about all the ways in which these kinds of laws and so on and so forth are also used by those that want to profit from urban city from city making, right? So I think I wouldn't even say that necessarily equal participation is what we're sort of aiming towards, because of course it would be complete chaos, but I think it's about representing different groups within democratic instances, right? And asking the right questions, and also I think it a lot of the time it's about context, right? And in the cities in the Global South module, we explore a lot how these kinds of solutions, models that are created in one place spread to the world, and then something is lost in translation, and sometimes the context for the implementation of a policy doesn't allow for the same results and creates unintended consequences and so on and so forth, or is a policy created for a reality, it's applied for a completely different reality. So geography is important, right? So the context is relevant. You have to pay attention to it. And I think, answering Phil's question more specifically, I'm quite sort of skeptical of the idea of building new towns and new cities from the ground up, because I'm skeptical of how sustainable that is in many ways, right? Because you're essentially spending a lot of energy and materials and resources to create new things, and we have lots of empty and unused or underused spaces in cities that could be refurbished and repurposed for accommodate the needs of citizens and so on. But I think, like, if new towns are to be built and so on and so forth, you know, the histories tell us that very, very often spaces for underprivileged people, for instance, are not there, or they are of poor quality, have less access, for instance, like that's across the board, right? Less access to environmental benefits, such as parks, such as good services, and so on and so forth. So I think, a more equitable kind of planning, but then you get into the kind of other aspect of sustainability, which is the financial one, right? That, of course, once you start providing everyone with everything, you end up with projects that might be unsustainable from the economic side. And we know that plays a big role in defining how projects are managed. But I think it's a long conversation. We can continue with the Q&A. Don't want to take more time, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much, both of you. This was a really rich, thoughtful discussion. I'm going to pause our recording now so that we can take some questions.